I'm going to put you flat on this grass in front of your little girl." Tyler Caldwell said loud enough for half the neighborhood to turn around. He threw a pair of gloves at Damon Carter's feet and waited. Damon did not look at the gloves. He looked at Tyler's hands. Nobody in Oak Creek saw anything unusual in the man standing across from him. A quiet black single father who never raised his voice, no matter how hard he was pushed. Nobody noticed the way his feet had already settled weight-low eyes locked on Tyler's hands instead of his face. That was not a stance a man picked up behind a keyboard. So why would someone who could end this in seconds choose to say nothing? If you like stories about the quietest person in the room, turning out to be the one everyone should have been paying attention to, hit subscribe right now because this one is about to get a lot more interesting. Damon Carter had built a good life out of small things. The morning run before Maya woke up. The vegetable bed turning over behind the house each spring. The cup of coffee going cold on the porch while the street came alive around him, and he let it pass without needing any of it to include him directly. Neighbors who walked by got a nod and sometimes a wave, and that was usually the whole conversation. To them, he was easy enough to read a quiet black man in his mid-40s, raising his 16-year-old daughter alone since his wife had passed 3 years earlier, careful with his money, careful with his words, doing some kind of contract security work out of a home office that nobody ever visited. The quiet kind of neighbor everyone appreciated, and almost nobody actually knew. What the street could not see was the way Damon always chose the seat with its back to the wall in any restaurant, or how little sleep he actually needed and how alert he remained in the hours when the rest of the block was fully under, or the fact that he could take apart and reassemble the deadbolt on his own front door faster than most people could locate their keys. He had spent 16 years in the Navy, the last 11 of them in operations that were never discussed at public briefings and never appeared in the kind of records a civilian could request. He had led SEAL Team 7 through 3 classified deployments and walked away from all of it with 2 things: a promise made to his wife Leah in her final weeks, and a discipline for silence so complete it had become indistinguishable from who he was. Leah had not asked him to pretend the past did not exist. What she asked was softer and harder to hold on to: make sure Maya grows up knowing you as more than whatever the war made of you. Damon had taken those words and folded them into something simpler and more absolute than she probably intended. No talk about the old life. No explanations. Nothing that could trace a line back to the man he used to be. He told himself this was what she meant, and he held on to that interpretation for 3 years the way a man holds on to a story he knows is incomplete, but does not yet have a better one to replace it. The contract work he still did came in through secure channels late at night through calls where his voice dropped into a register Maya had never once heard him use in ordinary conversation. He had been assigned as the lead federal security reviewer for a Department of Defense logistics contract bid. The kind of review that measured a company's safety record, its compliance history, its fitness to handle sensitive freight on government timelines. The case file in his locked drawer carried an internal reference number and a trucking company at its center, one whose driver had been left with a broken back after a brake failure on an interstate 3 months earlier. The brake maintenance records were missing. The case number was all he had, and he had no name yet to put beside it. He had no way of knowing that name was about to move into the house next door. The Caldwells arrived on a Thursday with 2 moving trucks and a kind of confidence that occupied more than its share of the street. Richard Caldwell introduced himself to the block inside of an afternoon, working his way from one front porch to the next with a story about the mayor's golf handicap and a joke about how his son's right hook was the only thing scarier than property taxes. Richard ran Caldwell Freight, a regional logistics company in the middle of a government contract bid, being reviewed by a federal examiner whose name Richard had never been given and had never thought to ask for. He shook hands with Damon over the fence, said something pleasant about being glad to have a security professional on the block, and Damon said something equally unremarkable back. Neither of them had any idea yet how tightly their situations were already connected. Tyler Richard's son was 21 years old and built as though every hour of his life had been aimed at physical dominance. He held a black belt in karate and a brown belt in Brazilian jiu-jitsu, and he carried an amateur MMA record that a small sports sponsor had been watching for months, waiting to see if the kid could stay clear of the kind of headline that made investors uncomfortable. He was genuinely skilled, not simply physically capable, but technically trained, the kind of opponent who understood how to use a cage and a crowd and the weight of an audience to press his advantage. What he lacked, and what Damon recognized within the first week of watching him, was any working relationship with the anger that had nowhere to go when there was no opponent in front of him. Richard had built that pressure into him since boyhood, a rule absorbed so early it registered as nature rather than instruction. A Caldwell is not permitted to look weak. The result was a young man with real ability and no understanding of what to do with the parts of himself that did not fit inside a fight. Damon decided, the way he made most decisions involving other people's problems, to stay out of it entirely. He told himself this was what peace looked like now, and for a few weeks he almost believed it. The first real crossing happened on a Tuesday afternoon. Maya was in the driveway washing her car music playing low enough that it barely reached the sidewalk when Tyler walked over from the Caldwell property, reached through her open window, and snapped the volume knob off the dashboard. He told her the noise was breaking his concentration during training. When she told him to leave, he took the phone out of her hand and threw it into the street, then told her she needed to learn her place before she got herself into something she was not prepared for. Damon had watched the whole thing from the porch. He crossed the yard, picked the phone up off the asphalt, and handed it back to Maya before turning to Tyler with a request rather than a threat. "Do not touch anything on this property that does not belong to you. Apologize to her and do not come back over here." Tyler moved toward him the way he moved toward opponents in the cage, using his size to compress the space between them, and told Damon that a man who spent his life hiding inside a house had no business telling anyone what to do, particularly a man who could finish a fight in one shot. Damon said nothing. He stood there until Tyler reading the stillness as fear finally walked away, laughing with his friends. That night, Maya started a folder on her phone without mentioning it to her father. The moment that changed the shape of everything came 6 weeks later at the back fence. Richard was making conversation in the easy testing way men use to gauge how much the person across from them actually knows, and he mentioned almost as an aside that Caldwell Freight's legal team was dealing with an unfavorable safety finding tied to a truck accident from earlier in the year. Damon kept his expression still, but the internal case number aligned before Richard finished his sentence, a single reference that told Damon exactly which file this was and exactly who was standing on the other side of his fence line. Richard caught something in the half-second before Damon answered, not enough to be certain of, but enough to worry about. From that point on, Richard's approach changed in ways he never said directly. He understood that if the federal reviewer responsible for evaluating Caldwell Freight's bid could be provoked into a visible act of aggression or misconduct on record, any finding he issued against the company could be challenged on grounds of bias. The reviewing officer's neutrality would be compromised. The file could be reassigned to someone without a conflict of interest attached to it. The bid might survive. Richard did not need Damon to leave the neighborhood. He needed Damon to make a mistake that was witnessed and documented, and he had a son with a short temper and a standing grievance already in motion to help him get there. He began encouraging Tyler in ways that were small and easy to deny afterward, letting him know which complaints Richard personally found reasonable, saying nothing on the occasions when things escalated, making it quietly clear that any consequence short of an arrest could be managed. Tyler, who already disliked Damon for reasons that had more to do with his own restlessness than anything Damon had actually done, did not need much encouragement. On a Friday afternoon, while Maya had friends on the back deck working through a school project, Tyler arrived at the property line with 2 gym friends and started kicking apart the row of lilac bushes Leah had planted along the fence years before she died, calling out insults loud enough to reach the deck. Damon came outside and asked them calmly to leave. Tyler stepped onto the grass, grabbed Damon by the collar, and shoved him backward toward Maya and her friends. What followed took less than a second. Damon caught Tyler's wrist, turned his hips into the contact, and had the younger man on his knees in the grass before anyone standing there fully understood what they had just watched. No punch thrown. No mark left. Only the gap in actual skill laid bare in front of 4 witnesses. Damon released him, immediately said something quiet about the wet ground, and helped him back to his feet as though nothing of consequence had happened. Tyler said nothing, but the look on his face made clear that whatever came next was no longer going to be a minor exchange at a fence line. Richard arrived within the hour, threatening lawsuits and connections at City Hall that could make things difficult in ways that had nothing to do with fair play. Underneath the noise was the same calculation he had been running all along: enough visible conflict, enough provocation on record, and the reviewing officer's professional neutrality went up for debate. Damon listened to all of it without raising his voice, and after Richard's car had turned the corner, he sat alone on the porch steps and let himself understand something he had been avoiding. His silence had not been keeping Maya safer. It had given Tyler a longer runway to test how far he could push things, and every time Damon absorbed the push without consequence, the line moved further out. He thought about what Leah had actually asked him for. He thought about the difference between what she meant and what he had built in her name, and for the first time those two things did not look exactly the same from where he was sitting. When Maya came outside and asked if everything was all right, he told her it was handled. Same answer as always. She accepted it the way she always accepted his answers, even as something in her expression made clear she was starting to want more from him than that. The Labor Day cookout was the one event on the block that nobody missed, folding tables dragged onto the shared green and half the neighborhood cycling through the grills in shifts. Damon brought Maya that morning, hoping for one ordinary afternoon, the kind where nobody needed him to be anything other than a father, standing near a cooler with a paper plate in his hand. For the first hour, that was almost what they got. Maya laughed with friends near the dessert table, and Damon let himself relax enough to talk to a neighbor about a fence post that needed replacing before winter. He noticed, without intending to, that he had positioned himself near the edge of the gathering with a clear line to the parking area, the way he always arranged himself in any crowd without consciously deciding to. It was a habit 16 years had left in him, and today he did not fight it. He let himself watch his daughter laugh at something one of her friends said, and for a few minutes the afternoon stayed exactly where it belonged. Richard arrived in a golf cart with a case of imported beer and the kind of energy that expected everything around it to adjust. Tyler walked in behind him, already carrying gloves under one arm, 4 friends from the gym trailing in a loose formation the way people walk when they are already performing for an audience they expect to accumulate. The crowd felt the shift before it understood what it was watching. The particular stillness that settles over a group when something is about to go wrong moved through the tables quietly, and then Tyler was already crossing the grass toward Damon. He threw the gloves down at Damon's feet loud enough that half the block turned to look. He announced that their last encounter had involved some kind of trick, that today they would settle it properly and in the open in front of everyone, so there would be no question left about anything. His friends angled their phones. A few people near the grill backed up without realizing they had moved. Damon did not reach for the gloves. He stepped sideways instead, positioning himself between Tyler and the place where Maya was standing near the dessert table, and said the only thing that mattered in that moment. "I'm not fighting you. Step back from my daughter." Tyler laughed, the performance version built for an audience rather than for himself, and kept going. He said something cruel and specific about Leah, about a woman he had never met, and told Maya she deserved a father willing to defend his own name in public instead of hiding behind stillness that accomplished nothing. "You want to raise a daughter who thinks hiding is the same as strength?" Tyler said loudly enough for the row of tables behind him to hear every word. "That's the lesson you're giving her right now, standing here doing nothing. Richard stood beside his son through all of it, nodding along at one point, saying something about covering whatever hospital costs came up afterward so there would be no complications. Maya tugged at Damon's sleeve and asked him quietly, "Please, please not to do this." Her voice was smaller than it usually was, and the sound of it tightened something in his chest more than any of Tyler's words had managed. Holding on to the same instinct that had guided him for 3 years, Damon turned to walk away. He read the situation the same way he always had. Leaving was the safest thing he could do for her right now. Tyler read the turn as surrender, and surrender in front of this many witnesses with his sponsor's name attached to his social media and friends already filming was something he was not willing to accept. He reached out and grabbed Maya by the arm to block her father's path, and the motion sent her stumbling hard onto the pavement, catching herself on one palm and scraping it badly enough to open the skin across her hand. Everything Damon had spent 3 years holding in the same careful place came apart in that instant. He crossed back to his daughter, helped her up, checked the scrape for anything serious, and handed her off to Diane Whitfield, who had already moved toward them from the edge of the nearest table. Then he turned fully around and faced Tyler for the first time that afternoon with nothing left to manage or contain. He gave him the one last chance the situation still allowed for, delivered low and levels slower than anything else he had said all day. "Apologize to her. Leave the cook out. This ends right here if you walk away now." Tyler pulled on his gloves and glanced back at his friends to confirm the phones were still recording. He told Damon he was going to make sure Maya watched her father carried off the grass unconscious so that everyone in Oak Creek would finally understand which family actually ran this street. Damon took off the flannel shirt he was wearing over a gray undershirt, folded it once, and set it on the edge of the nearest folding table. The motion was unhurried and exact the same way he did everything, and he turned to face the open patch of grass where Tyler was already moving into position. Tyler opened with a fast combination, his hands quick and well-trained from 1,000 rounds of sparring, the kind of opening sequence that had worked for him in every cage he had ever stepped into. Damon slipped the first strike and moved into the empty space beside him, using Tyler's own forward momentum to send him stumbling face first into the grass in front of the entire crowd. A few people laughed before they caught themselves, and that sound did more damage to Tyler's composure than the stumble itself had. Tyler reset and came back with a spinning kick that had appeared in highlight reels, the kind of technique that looked as good on film as it worked in a real exchange. Damon read the wind-up and closed the distance before the kick could fully extend, hooked the standing leg out from under him, and put him down a second time. The kick connected partway a glancing blow across Damon's left shoulder that staggered him half a step and pulled a sharp intake of breath from the people nearest to them. Nobody laughed after that. It was plain to everyone watching that this was not going to be a clean one-sided display. Damon was not untouchable, and the crowd could see it clearly enough that the tone of everything shifted slightly. He asked Tyler to stay down. He had not thrown a single punch of his own yet, and he did not intend to start. For a few seconds, Tyler held still on the ground with his chest heaving, his knee scraped raw from the second fall, and something crossed to his expression that looked like the first genuine recognition that he had walked into something he had badly misjudged. Then he looked past Damon toward where Richard was standing, and whatever doubt had been forming closed back up. Richard was shouting from the sideline, telling his son to get up to do whatever it took, feeding him just enough pressure to override whatever instinct toward self-preservation Tyler had left. Tyler surged up and came forward with a full takedown attempt, arms wrapping low around Damon's waist, trying to drive him back into the crowd. Damon dropped his hips, turned into the momentum rather than against it, and took Tyler face down into the grass in a hold that pinned both arms and left him completely unable to roll or free himself. Tyler thrashed against the hold panic starting to enter his voice for the first time all afternoon, and Damon kept his grip controlled and told him quietly to tap out that it was over, that there was nothing left to win from this position. When Tyler refused more out of pride than any real hope of getting free, Richard screamed from the sideline that Damon was going to hurt his son and lunged toward the two of them, knocking a folding chair sideways as he came across the grass. In the chaos of that moment, Tyler's free hand found a metal rod near the grill equipment, one of the long-handled tools used to manage the coals, and he swung it hard in Damon's direction. The rod missed by less than an arm's length and kept traveling in its arc toward Maya, who had broken free from Diane and run back toward her father the moment the shouting turned frantic and loud. There was nothing left to weigh. Damon shoved Maya clear with one arm and stripped the rod from Tyler's grip, in the same motion sending it spinning onto the grass well away from either of them. Then he drove Tyler face down and locked both arms behind his back so completely that he could not move an inch in any direction. Something in Damon's voice changed, as he did it dropping into a register that had nothing left of the quiet neighbor who fixed gutters and waved from the porch every morning. It was flat, precise, and entirely certain of itself, the voice of a man who had once issued orders in places where hesitation was measured in the lives it cost. Standing near the outer edge of the crowd was a man named James Whitmore, a retired Navy admiral visiting his son, a veteran who lived 2 streets over and had brought him along for the long weekend. Whitmore had not needed a technique demonstration to understand what he was looking at. He stepped forward through the gathered neighbors until he could see Damon's face clearly from close range, and he said the only thing that needed to be said. "Commander Carter, I didn't expect to see you at a neighborhood cookout." Nobody spoke for a long moment. Tyler, still pinned beneath the weight of a man he had spent months believing he could put on the ground, understood in that instant how completely he had misjudged everything from the first afternoon he crossed the driveway. There was no account of missions or commendations, no speech about anything. Just one sentence from a man whose voice carried enough weight on its own to end every other conversation, happening on that grass simultaneously. Whitmore had served alongside Damon, had signed off on deployments, had stood across a table from him in a room overseas that neither of them would ever publicly describe, and he recognized the face across from him as clearly as he recognized anything from that chapter of his life. Damon released Tyler's wrists, carefully checked that the young man could move both shoulders, and stepped back. He stood in the middle of the green space, aware of every eye on him, the flannel shirt still folded on a table, 20 feet away, the metal rod lying in the grass where he had thrown it well away from Tyler. 3 years of quiet mornings and careful distance had come apart in the span of one afternoon, and there was no folder in any locked drawer that was going to put it back together. Maya reached him a moment later, her scraped hand pressed against her side, and for a few seconds neither of them said anything. She looked at him the way she had never quite looked at him before, not with fear, but with something that felt like the beginning of recognition, as if a version of her father she had always sensed but never clearly seen had finally stepped fully into the light. Richard called the police within minutes, describing everything as an unprovoked attack by a former soldier who had used military training on his unarmed son without cause. When the first officer arrived, he directed Damon to the ground first, even though Tyler was still a few feet away, and the metal rod lay in plain view between them. Diane Whitfield, who had lived on the block for 20 years, said clearly enough for the officer to hear that the man who had just shoved his daughter out of the path of a swinging rod should not be the first one asked to lie face down on the pavement. The officer hesitated, looking between the rod, Tyler, and Damon, standing with both hands visible and his voice even, and the version of events Richard had been building on the phone slowed down enough to be questioned. Diane had video she had captured from her own porch. Cody Bennett, a teenager who had been near the grill from the start, had been recording from the moment Tyler threw the gloves down. The footage showed Tyler making specific threats, grabbing Maya reaching for the rod. By the time the second officer had finished taking statements from the neighbors still gathered around, it was Tyler, not Damon, who was looking at a potential charge for assault with a dangerous weapon. Richard stood at the edge of the grass, staring at the officer, explaining this to him, visibly unable to account for how the afternoon had arranged itself into this shape. 3 things followed over the next week that hit the Carter household in different ways. The first was the video. Richard paid to have the raw footage cut down, removing every frame that showed Tyler reaching for the rod and every moment that made the sequence of events legible, then releasing the remainder under a headline built for outrage: a former special operations soldier attacking a young amateur fighter at a neighborhood party without provocation. The edited version spread faster than anyone in the family could have anticipated. The second was school. Maya walked into her second period class to find 3 phones angled toward her before she reached her seat. A boy she barely knew asked her without much cruelty, but without any gentleness either, whether it was true her dad had some kind of breakdown at the party. She said nothing, sat down, and got through the rest of the day the way she had gotten through most hard things in her life, by keeping her face completely still and waiting for the hours to pass. She did not tell her father that night what the hallways had been like. The third was the caseworker. A woman from Child Protective Services came to the house on a Tuesday afternoon, polite and methodical, explaining that an anonymous complaint had raised concerns about violence in the home and that she was required to follow up regardless of the circumstances surrounding the video. She asked Maya a few questions alone in the living room, while Damon waited in the kitchen, forcing himself to stay in the chair, even as every instinct told him to pace. When she came to find him, she said Maya had been consistent and clear, and that nothing in the home gave her any actual concern, but that the file would remain open for a standard follow-up visit. Damon answered every question without raising his voice, let her walk through the house, and stood at the kitchen window a long time after she left, watching Maya's outline through the curtain upstairs, thinking about how many years he had spent believing that keeping everything sealed away was the same thing as keeping her protected from it. To defend himself against the complaint, he faced a choice that felt almost impossible to make on his own. Proving that his actions on the grass had been controlled rather than aggressive meant releasing part of a military record that had been sealed for years, a record he had spent 3 years keeping as far from Maya's daily life as he could manage. He sat at his desk one night with the locked drawer open in front of him and read through pages he had not looked at since Leah died, commendations and after-action reports written in language that felt like it described someone else entirely. He closed the drawer without making a decision, telling himself he still had time, though some part of him already understood which way this was going. Maya found out about the complaint before he told her, having caught enough of a phone call between him and his lawyer to fill in the rest. She came to the kitchen table that evening and sat across from him with her bandaged hand in her lap and said the things she had been holding for a long time. If you hadn't kept everything hidden for so long, she told him, maybe people would have known who you were from the beginning. Maybe Tyler never pushes this far if everyone on this street already understood what you survived to come home to us. Damon did not have an answer ready for that, which was its own kind of answer. For 3 years he had told himself that silence was the same as safety, that keeping everything folded into drawers and files was how he honored what Leah had asked of him. Sitting across from Maya, watching her hold her injured hand and ask a question he could not simply redirect the way he always had, he understood for the first time that the thing he had built to protect her had also left her exposed in ways he had never intended and never once seen coming. He reached across the table and told her the truth as plainly as he could, no folder standing between them this time. He had misread what Leah asked him for at the end. She had not wanted him to disappear behind his own silence or become a version of himself that never spoke about the things that mattered. She had wanted Maya to know him as more than whatever the war had shaped, and somewhere along the way he had turned that into a wall instead of a door his daughter could walk through when she needed him. He had been scared of what people would think if they knew everything, and that fear had been running his decisions for longer than he wanted to say out loud. He told her he was more afraid of something now, of her looking at his silence and deciding it was a kind of strength worth copying, when all it had ever actually been was him trying to outrun his own grief. Maya did not have a full answer ready for that either. She nodded slowly the way a person does when they are still deciding how much of their forgiveness is available and in what form, and she reached over and set her uninjured hand briefly on top of his before pulling it back. The two of them sat together in the kitchen without saying much more, and the quiet between them finally felt different than all the quiet that had come before it. Outside, the neighborhood was still passing around a video that told only half the truth, and somewhere across town behind a desk, still crowded with unopened moving boxes, Richard Caldwell believed he had already won. He had no idea that the move he was planning to make next was about to hand the last piece of the case against him to the one person least likely to let it pass quietly. Damon was not a hidden company owner. He was the lead federal security reviewer assigned by the Department of Defense to evaluate Caldwell Freight's bid for a $40 million logistics contract, a role that gave him the authority to approve or disqualify any bidder who failed to meet the government's safety and conduct standards. He had taken the assignment months before the Caldwells moved next door, before he had any reason to connect a file number to a neighbor, and neither man had known the other's full position when they first shook hands over that fence line. Richard's lawyer, working through the pressure campaign against Damon, eventually traced his government role and brought it to Richard during a call that same week. Richard's response was not to step back. It was to contact every connection he had pointing toward Washington and demand that Damon be removed from any file touching his company on the grounds that a man who had assaulted his son at a neighborhood cookout had no business serving as a neutral evaluator of anything bearing the Caldwell name. That demand landed through a chain of contacts Richard did not fully understand at the desk of James Whitmore, who still consulted for the department on contractor security and review matters. Richard did not know Whitmore had been standing 15 feet away on that grass. Whitmore let Richard finish his entire account without interrupting, listening to the description of Damon as unstable and dangerous and compromised, listening to mentions of donors and a mayor's office and a willingness to escalate as high as necessary. Richard laid out his case the way he did most things, with the confidence of a man who assumes the person listening has less information than he does. Whitmore then said in a tone that gave nothing away about how far beyond appropriate this conversation had already gone, that the man Richard wanted removed was among the most trusted commanders who had ever served under his direct authority, that he had personally signed off on deployments he was still not authorized to discuss publicly, and that he had been present at the incident Richard was describing and had watched the full sequence of events from the beginning. He added that the conduct Richard had just described to him, attempting to pressure a federal reviewer, suppressing evidence, and intimidating witnesses during an active conduct investigation, was not a personnel matter. It was a conflict of interest with serious legal consequences attached. Before ending the call, Whitmore said he intended to have the entire account documented and submitted to the department's Ethics Review Office that same afternoon. Caldwell Freight was suspended from the bidding process within days, pending a full investigation into its leadership's conduct toward the reviewing officer and into the safety violations already on file. Damon learned about Whitmore's letter secondhand through a colleague who assumed he already knew. He sat with the phone still in his hand afterward, understanding exactly what had just opened up in front of him. He had the authority on paper to sign off on Caldwell Freight's disqualification himself. One afternoon, one signature, and it was over on his terms. Nobody in the department would have questioned the decision given everything already in the record. He turned it over the way he used to turn over decisions that had real weight attached to them. He understood what happened if he signed it. Richard would spend years telling anyone willing to listen that a former special operator had used a federal review to finish a personal dispute, and no matter how solid the evidence underneath the conclusion, that story would find an audience. The legitimate part of the outcome would collapse under the way it looked. More than that, sitting alone at his desk with the disqualification letter drafted in front of him, Damon understood something about himself that he was only recently willing to say clearly. He had spent 3 years confusing control with strength. He was not going to correct that mistake by trading it for a different version of the same thing, where his own hand decided the ending, because it was the fastest and most satisfying option available. He thought about Leah. He thought about how she would have read that choice, and the thought settled the matter before any argument about strategy could. He recused himself from the review entirely, submitted every piece of evidence he had accumulated to an independent board with no connection to either party, and stepped back. He let people who owed him nothing decide what came next. Maya made a decision of her own around the same time, and she did not tell her father she was making it. She had spent weeks saving screenshots quietly, messages Tyler had sent to other kids on the block, videos he had posted mocking people smaller than him, a pattern of behavior that stretched back months before he had ever set foot on the Carter property. She brought all of it to Cody Bennett, along with what she knew about the full unedited footage that Richard's lawyers had failed to actually delete because Cody had backed it up in a location they had never thought to check. Together they got the complete footage and everything Maya had collected to the local police and to a reporter known for verifying information carefully before publishing anything. The reporter asked Maya directly why she had waited as long as she had to come forward. Maya answered her honestly. For a while, she said she had believed silence was simply what her family did. It was what she had grown up watching, and she had never had any reason to think it was a choice, rather than just the way things worked. Then she realized that belief had never actually kept anyone safe, including herself. Damon found out after it was already done, standing in the kitchen, while Maya stood in the doorway and explained herself with her chin raised, ready for him to be upset that she had acted without telling him first. He was not upset. He recognized what he was looking at. The same instinct that had once guided him through situations nobody was supposed to know. Existed the instinct to act, rather than hold position, indefinitely had come through in his daughter. And for the first time he let himself feel proud of it, instead of afraid of where it might lead her. The full uncut footage changed everything within days of reaching people with the authority to act on it. It showed exactly what the edited version had removed, Tyler reaching for the rod, Damon moving to push Maya clear the complete sequence, as it had actually happened, rather than the version Richard had paid to construct. The reporter ran the story alongside Maya's collected evidence, laying out a pattern of behavior that made the cookout look less like a single bad afternoon and more like the end of a much longer escalation. The independent board reviewing Caldwell Freight's conduct did not require much more than that, combined with the pattern of witness intimidation and evidence suppression already documented. The company was formally disqualified from the federal contract and removed from the government's approved vendor list entirely. Whitmore called Damon once the board's decision was finalized, not to offer congratulations, but to tell him plainly that stepping away from the review had been the right call, the kind of judgment that separated a commander worth trusting from one who simply wanted to be the person holding the final decision. Tyler was charged with assault involving a dangerous weapon and accepted a plea agreement, probation, community service, and a mandatory anger management program. His gym owner, Daniel Cross, a man who had built his reputation on discipline as much as on technical skill, called his full training staff together and played the unedited footage in front of everyone before stripping Tyler's black belt and banning him from the facility permanently. He told him plainly in front of every younger fighter who had once looked up to him that a martial artist who used his training to threaten a child had already failed the only evaluation that actually mattered in that gym. The room stayed silent while Cross spoke, and none of the fighters still in good standing would meet Tyler's eyes as he walked out for the last time. The sponsorship company withdrew its offer within the week, issuing no public statement and simply removing his name from every platform connected to the brand. Several friends who had been at the cookout filming stopped returning his calls. The phones that had once been raised to capture his highlight moments stayed in pockets whenever he walked into a room, and Tyler found himself moving through his own neighborhood in the particular silence of someone who has discovered that the attention he built his identity around was never as unconditional as he believed. The CPS file was closed without further action. The caseworker who had conducted the original visit called personally to let Damon know, adding that she rarely saw cases close this cleanly and that she hoped the family's fall was considerably quieter than the summer had been. Richard's board of directors, facing an active federal investigation into safety violations the company had quietly managed around for years, voted to force his resignation within the month. His name came off the letterhead. The contract he had mortgaged his reputation to protect was gone before the year turned. Damon did not feel what he had sometimes imagined he might feel when all of this was finally over. What settled in was something closer to fatigue, the particular weight of watching something end the right way after a long stretch of uncertainty about whether it would. He thought more than once that week about how easy it would have been to feel only vindication, and how strange it was that what he actually felt was quieter and harder to name than that. He called his coordinator at the firm to formally resume the work that had been paused. She told him the Caldwell file was permanently sealed under his name and that she was glad to have him back. He thanked her, set the phone down, and stood in his kitchen for a few minutes without doing anything in particular, which felt like its own small gift. A few weeks later, on a late afternoon when the light was going flat and the air had shifted enough toward fall to feel different from summer, Tyler appeared at the fence line without gloves and without anyone behind him. The moving truck was already in the Caldwell driveway, half-loaded the for sale sign back in the yard. He looked younger than he had all summer, his hands in his jacket pockets, nothing left to perform for an audience that was no longer there. Damon set down the shears he had been using along the fence and walked over without hurrying the way he moved toward most things now. Tyler asked him in a voice smaller than any he had used since the first afternoon he crossed the driveway why Damon hadn't broken his arm that day on the grass when he clearly could have. I'd already won by then, Damon told him. Tyler did not understand it right away. He looked past Damon toward where Maya was kneeling a few feet back, a small trowel in her hand and dirt on her knees, and something moved through his expression that was slow enough to seem real. He was only beginning to understand that Damon had never been talking about the fight. He stood there a moment longer as if waiting for more, then nodded once and walked back toward the driveway without another word. Damon watched him go, then knelt back down beside Maya in the dirt. The two of them spent the rest of that evening replanting the lilac bushes Leah had put in along the fence years before the war had a name in their house, the ones Tyler had kicked apart back in the spring. The branches had been bent hard, and more than a few had snapped, but the roots had held, and there was more still alive in the ground than either of them had expected when they first pulled the damaged parts clear. Maya pressed her trowel into the soil and asked her father without looking up from what her hands were doing whether fighting that day had meant breaking the promise he made to her mother. Damon thought about it the honest way before he answered. He told her he had not fought to prove he was stronger than Tyler. He had done what was necessary to keep her safe, and somewhere in the middle of all of it he had finally understood the difference between those two things, a difference he should have seen a long time before he actually did. Maya pressed her palm flat against the soil beside the root they had just covered and told him she did not need a perfect father. She just needed one who stopped hiding things from her. Damon did not have a speech for that. He nodded the kind of nod that meant more between the two of them than most things said out loud, and they stayed in the dirt until the light went fully and the street grew quiet around them. Two hands in the same patch of ground, the lilac bushes standing a little straighter than they had in months, new growth already working its way up through the damaged branches, quietly the way most real changes tend to go. What does real strength look like in your own life? Tell us in the comments below, hit subscribe, and we'll see you in the next story.